Hi, everyone. I'm Lindsay Reiser in for Vladimir Duthier. We are following breaking news. Vice President Kamala Harris has officially chosen Minnesota Governor Tim Walz as her running mate on the 2024 Democratic ticket. It comes after she clinched the Democratic nomination last night. Now, Walz has been the governor of Minnesota for 6 years. He's a seasoned politician and familiar with how Congress works, serving 6 terms in the House of Representatives and sitting as a ranking member of the Veterans Affairs Committee. He also has a public teaching background. Later today, Harris and Walz will kick off a multi-day tour of battleground states starting in Philadelphia. I want to start with senior White House correspondent Weijia Jiang. Weijia, you were part of the team that helped break this for CBS News, and you actually have reporting that this was a down-to-the-wire decision, even with Harris's team printing out multiple signs and banners for this event.
Lindsay, you're absolutely right. When the vice president went to bed last night, a source familiar with her thinking and the process told us that she did not know who she was going to choose to be her running mate. But then she woke up and decided it was Governor Tim Walz and started making phone calls to all of the finalists to inform them of the decision before it became public. And one thing, Lindsay, that really stands out, you can see here as our viewers look at his resume, he is a real winner. I mean, this is a man who has won 6 terms in Congress in a sprawling part of Minnesota that borders several red patches in Iowa. He is in his 2nd term as governor, and currently he is the chair of the Democratic Governors Association. So all of that leadership could really make a difference when it comes to trying to broker deals and navigate the halls of Congress if it were to be a Harris-Walz administration and she wanted to focus so much on her legislative agenda. He could really help on that. But Lindsay, at the end of the day, aides told me that what really matters to Harris when she's thinking about any staffing pick are the vibes, the chemistry. How does she get along with this person? Do they have a rapport where they can get down to the hard work that they'll be doing? And from what we know of Governor Walz, he is a pretty happy-go-lucky guy. He is very jolly, and he's also able to be nice when he is on the attack. In fact, in the early days that it was clear that it was going to be Vice President Harris at the top of the ticket, we were not talking about Governor Walz. There were other big names that were in the mix. But then, you know what? He went on TV, he called Republicans weird, and it really stuck. So that matters, because along with those huge folders and binders of voting records and personal statements that these candidates made, the vice president was also looking at them on the stump. She was watching clips of them on television to see if they could land, a defense that really stuck and resonated. And Walz was able to do that with a singular word, weird. And so all of this came together, Lindsay, into this very dramatic and life-changing moment for the governor, who we have yet to hear from, but we expect we will very soon. And of course, we'll get our maybe first glimpse of them together in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, when they hold a rally in a few hours.
Weijia, I want to ask you, he does have a successful track record of pushing a Democratic agenda at a Midwestern state. We know he enjoys popularity there, but he is a bit of a lesser name nationally. I want to ask you about maybe some of the weaknesses that the Harris campaign had to contend with when it came to this decision. We know that each person sort of has their pros and their cons. We know the Trump camp is already labeling this as an incredibly liberal, extreme left ticket. What are some of the, I guess, drawbacks that you see Walz bringing potentially?
Well, I think you really nailed it, Lindsay, in that people don't know who he is. I mean, they're going to be introduced to him for the most part today. And, when you look at some of the other big names, the advantage that they had was name recognition, especially someone like, Secretary Pete Buttigieg, who is a current member of the Biden administration. And to your point, he doesn't necessarily bring the moderate voting record that some of these other candidates could have. And he does not come from a battleground state like some of these other potentials. And so that's, I think, the team putting their faith and placing a bet on Walz, thinking that once people do get to know him and hear from him and see him on the campaign trail stumping for her, that it will be enough to make up for those things that he does not have. But again, this was a decision really based on not only who could be a governing partner, but Harris wanted to choose someone who could come in and be president of the United States also. And she knows very well that you never know what's going to happen. So she wanted to pick somebody that would be ready for the top job if necessary. And again, when you look at all of his experience, that really plays a big role here, Lindsay.
Weijia Jiang, thanks so much. Let's bring in CBS News political contributor Ashley Etienne. Ashley served as communications director for Vice President Harris. So Ashley, before we get into Vice President Harris's thinking and what you think about why she came to this decision, I want to ask you about messaging because Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi was on CBS Mornings this morning, and she said Democrats need to be better about messaging. When we hear voters saying that they think that a Republican ticket could be better for their wallets, do you think this is something that Governor Walz could help with?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the point was made that he introduced this notion of weird, and it sort of caught fire within the Democratic Party. But he's also, and I worked with him in the House too when I worked for Speaker Pelosi. He's also very adept at taking very complex issues and breaking them down in ways that the average person understands how they affect their lives, and driving a message about how Democrats are going to help solve those challenges and address those challenges. So I think he's really adept at messaging. But the other thing that I think is really important is that he's absolutely fearless. He's going to be able to compliment Kamala Harris. She's not one for having a big television, news, media presence, and he actually will help fill that gap for her. You could see him on television scrapping it out with Republicans and advancing the balls in terms of messaging. So I think that's going to be value add for her and for the Democratic Party going into the election.
How crucial is the bottom of the ticket decision in maybe those independent swing voters haven't made their minds up yet? How important is today's decision for them?
Well, there's been all this talk that the vice presidential pick doesn't matter much. I mean, tell that to J.D. Vance and Donald Trump. I mean, he's been a drag on their ticket. So it does actually matter. I think that what Walz brings to the table is not just his breadth of experience from being a military officer to a former teacher to a chairman on Capitol Hill to a governor, but also his ability to go into these battleground states, the suburban areas, the rural areas. That's the 1% to 2% that's going to make the difference in this election. And he speaks their language. He knows their issues. He's dealt with many of them at any stage of his professional and political career. So I think that's the advantage he's going to bring to the table. And I will also add this, too. I'm hearing from the campaign that, his children were conceived via IVF. And so he's also going to be leaning into the issue of reproductive rights, which we know is incredibly important. 70% of women right now think that that's the top issue in this election. So to have him lean in and bolster what the vice president's already been doing on this issue is going to be incredibly transformative.
Ashley, what is your advice to the campaign to counter some of these extreme left arguments we are already seeing emerge from the Trump-Vance camp?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've got to run your race. I mean, we're in the middle of the Olympics, and I was a track runner, and and there's a saying that you've got to run your race, and so they've got to stay very focused on running their race and understanding who's going to matter in this election. CBS just recently had a poll that showed that Kamala Harris is outperforming among that coalition that Biden built in 2020 to win. In fact, she's doing better with low propensity voters, those that don't vote very frequently, and men. She's not bleeding support among men. So she's in an incredibly solid position. So some of this criticism, they're going to have to let just roll right off of them because they've got an actual growth strategy, whereas Donald Trump does not. And Tim Walz is going to be, I think, very critical and crucial to moving some of those disaffected Republicans and those independent voters, creating a permission structure for them to support Kamala Harris.
Ashley Etienne, thank you.
Thank you.
Let's bring in CBS News Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes. Nancy, you are in Philadelphia there in anticipation of this event. First of all, what news do you have in regards to this pick?
Well, Lindsay, I've just spoken to someone who was close to the VP vetting process, and they gave me some really interesting insights about why Walz was the pick at the end of the day. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what they had to say, because it's very interesting. Why Walz was chosen. First, they say because of his executive experience, the fact that he has a strong record of accomplishment for the middle class that mirrors what the Harris campaign would like to do nationally if she is elected, including a child tax credit, paid leave, gun safety, and codifying Roe v. Wade in his state. Second, this is very fascinating. The reason they liked him so much was because he had a terrific bio that they think will appeal in key Midwest states that they must win. And that is code for Wisconsin and Michigan. Why do they like his bio so much? First of all, he's a veteran. He served in the National Guard. He's a former football coach. He is a hunter and gun owner himself. He talks about that a lot. He's got a deep connection to rural America. He's often talking about his hillbilly cousins and the fact that he went to a high school that had only 24 kids in the graduating class, and he won in a Trump district as a House member. They obviously believe that he's an effective messenger. He coined the phrase that is now on every Democrat's lips, which is weird, and that has definitely kind of thrown the Trump team off balance. And then finally, they say he's got a strong personal rapport with Harris, and she had confidence that he would be a great governing partner. This may come as something of a surprise, Lindsay, to Americans who maybe hadn't heard a lot about Tim Walz before a couple of weeks ago, because he wasn't someone who had been seeking the presidency like Pete Buttigieg, or rumored to possibly want it in the future like Josh Shapiro. But in the end, it sounds like that may have been a selling point. The fact that Harris would not have to look over her shoulder, would not have to worry about handing off some of the less desirable jobs to him, because he was positioning himself for a bid for the presidency himself in 4 to 8 years, but that he would be willing to roll up his sleeves and do the jobs that she wants to hand off to him.
Let's talk about Shapiro for a second, though, because obviously they are kicking off this battleground tour in Philadelphia. How do you think voters will receive Walz instead of maybe who they thought would be at the bottom of the ticket, their own governor?
You know, I think it's very possible that Pennsylvania voters will be relieved that Shapiro is not going to be leaving the governor's mansion here in Pennsylvania. He has been governor now for less than 2 years. He's quite popular here. And the fact that he is sticking around may be welcomed by Pennsylvania voters. We know that he is going to continue to hit the campaign trail on the Harris-Walz ticket's behalf. In fact, at the event that's taking place this evening here in Philadelphia, he is scheduled to speak before Harris and Walz. So like many of the Democrats who were in that top tier but ultimately were not chosen, there's every expectation that they are going to be good soldiers and going to continue to make the case for the Harris-Walz ticket.
Nancy Cordes, thank you so much for that breaking reporting. Appreciate it. For more on this, let's bring in CBS News Chief Election and Campaign Correspondent Robert Costa. So, Robert, we know that the list had dwindled down from what was almost a dozen names, including the likes of Wes Moore, Gretchen Whitmer, Mark Kelly. It was whittled down to several men in battleground states. Was Walz the safe pick?
It's great to be with you. Governor Walz represents, to many of my top Democratic sources, an opportunity to keep that Biden coalition stitched together that Vice President Harris worked on with the president back in 2020. Now they have an opportunity to make sure organized labor, educators, those with military service stay together, stay in line. And you see with Governor Walz someone who is willing to go to the industrial Midwest to work on issues that are important to organized labor, progressive activists. He comes out of the House of Representatives as well. So he has a lot of ties in Washington, is well liked by the Democratic political leadership. And he's someone who is not going to be someone who harms the ticket in any way, based on my conversations with top Democrats.
Bob, I'll let you get your earpiece back in if you can hear me. So maybe sort of the do no harm pick. But I want to ask you also, part of this pick, it seems to me, is to set Democrats up for the future as well. We don't know what's going to happen, but you're sort of anointing the future stars of the Democratic Party with a pick like this. Do you think Walz will sort of catch fire in a way that we've seen from other VP picks?
We'll have to see how he performs. He's someone who is generationally the same as Vice President Harris, but she is now the story in the Democratic Party. And by picking Governor Walz, they're picking someone who has a folksy demeanor, someone who might catch fire with a lot of activists, but at the same time is not going to be competing with her. But you never know what happens with vice presidents. Think about President Biden. When he was selected in 2008 by then Senator Obama, he was seen as someone in the near winter of his career that would be unlikely to ever run for president. But he decided to run for president years later in 2020 after deciding against it in 2016. So things happen. This will make Walz a star in many respects in Democratic politics. But if Vice President Harris loses, vice presidential candidates often fade into the history books. We don't talk a lot about former House Speaker Paul Ryan, even though he's a relatively young man in American politics. He was on the ticket with Romney in 2012. Tim Kaine was on the ticket with a high-profile contender like Secretary Clinton in 2016. He's a respected senator, but he's not someone who's being touted as a constant presidential figure.
Bob, from your sources in the Trump-Vance campaign, do you think that Walz is somebody who they wanted to be on the ticket with Harris? I can foresee if Shapiro was the pick, for example, somebody potentially a little more moderate, especially when it comes to the issue of Israel and Gaza, obviously the must-win state of Pennsylvania. Do you think that that would have been more frightening for them than a Walz pick?
Shapiro is a known political entity in Pennsylvania, my home state, and he would be able to really build a campaign in the Philadelphia suburbs, central Pennsylvania, western Pennsylvania with smarts and know-how. That's not to say he's not going to be involved. I mean, the Harris campaign is going to count on Shapiro to do everything he can to win Pennsylvania for the Harris-Walz ticket. And knowing Shapiro for nearly 2 decades, I have no doubt he's going to dig in and help Harris as much as possible. But by not having his name on the ticket, you don't get the same kind of political capital in Pennsylvania that you might otherwise. But they're making a bet with Walz that he can still play in a place like Pennsylvania, as well as other states that have industrial pass because of his persona, because of his record.
Robert Costa, thank you. Of course, we are watching all of today's developments, including we will see this Harris-Walz ticket for the first time around 5:30 Eastern in Pennsylvania tonight. We're also going to see Donald Trump's VP choice, J.D. Vance, will be in Philadelphia today for a campaign event. That's expected around noon. So we're going to talk more about the two sides competing in the Keystone State on the other side of the break. You're streaming CBS News 24/7. Vice President Kamala Harris has officially chosen Minnesota Governor Tim Walz as her running mate on the 2024 Democratic ticket. It comes after she clinched the Democratic nomination last night. CBS News campaign reporter Aaron Navarro joins me now from Pennsylvania. So, Aaron, you are actually at Governor Josh Shapiro's home. Any statement from him yet so far?
Good to be with you. That is right. Something actually just broke where Governor Shapiro put out a long statement kind of signifying that he was part of this VP vetting process, but emphasizing that he is still going to support Vice President Harris in these next 92 or so days in Pennsylvania, a crucial state, in addition to saying that Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota is a strong addition to the ticket. And generally, the vibe of his statement is saying that he's not done here in Pennsylvania. Of course, Governor Shapiro is just a year or so into his first term, was inaugurated in January 2023. Just starting out his term here as governor, and at least in this statement, he looks forward to continuing that, but at least acknowledging that he was part of this whole process.
Harris and Walz will start their swing state blitz in Philadelphia. What do we know about what we can expect to hear from them?
Well, it'll be the debut of them, and they'll be going to several swing states. In addition to here in Philadelphia, they're going to go to the Midwest, Nevada, and Arizona. We're really going to be looking to see if Walz is continuing this messaging of calling Republicans, quote, weird, as well as maybe addressing some of the early Republican attacks that are coming. Republicans, including Trump's campaign, are tying Minnesota Governor Tim Walz to the protests and riots that happened in Minnesota after the death of George Floyd. Again, tying the Democratic ticket to crime, kind of stoking some of those fears. We'll see if Governor Walz addresses that in any way tonight. Otherwise, Walz has had a very joyous kind of brand tied to him in these last couple of weeks. A lot of talk about unifying both Democrats and Republicans. We'll see if that message continues now that he's the running mate and can potentially represent the whole country.
And Aaron, I know that you have been on the campaign trail talking to voters. Up until this decision, who was the name that you heard the most when you talked to the electorate about who they wanted Harris to pick?
Well, admittedly, I was in the Pennsylvania bubble. I've been here for a week or so. So Josh Shapiro's name was constant from voters. But I also heard from voters that they also were bittersweet if he was chosen because they didn't want to see him go. They believe that he is an effective governor here. In addition to Shapiro, I really wasn't hearing that much Walz, at least here in Pennsylvania. I was hearing about Arizona Senator Mark Kelly, the astronaut there that folks here are familiar with. So it'll be interesting to see how the crowd here in Philadelphia reacts to Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota, a couple states away, when he's on the stage with Harris later.
Aaron Navarro, thank you. I want to go to CBS News political reporter Hunter Woodall now. Hunter, I know you're going to be talking about the response from the Trump-Vance camp, but I also know that you've been taking a deep dive into Walz's background. Catch our viewers up to speed on what he's accomplished thus far and what he's known for.
Absolutely. Good morning, Lindsay. Governor Walz is an interesting politician, an interesting Democrat for this moment. This is somebody who served 6 terms in the U.S. House. He was representing this sprawling kind of rural district in Minnesota alongside the Iowa border, had some major urban centers in there as well. But he was doing this from 2006 to 2007 to 2019, at which point he won the governor's race in Minnesota in the 2018 midterms and obviously won re-election in 2022. This is somebody who has that ability. They were a former House member. They know how the power centers of Washington work, but also has that executive experience, as a governor. He has seen his state, obviously, through some difficult times, the coronavirus pandemic, obviously the 2020 murder of George Floyd and the rioting that followed afterwards was a tense topic. That's how the governor responded and handled that is likely to come up this campaign cycle. But he's also benefited from having Democratic majorities in the Minnesota House and the Minnesota Senate after the 22 midterms, and he's been able to help pass major Democratic legislative priorities. That's a record that's likely going to be an asset or a hindrance as he faces voters in the coming weeks and months.
So let's talk about Trump, Vance, and how they're responding to the Walz VP announcement. I mean, obviously they're trying to paint him as I'm paraphrasing here, but sort of a West Coast elite wannabe, trying to distance himself from his identity as a Midwest governor. I want to hear more about how you think their strategy will play out now, what else they're saying.
Well, as you said, we're seeing this, the Republican side, the Trump campaign, trying to paint, Governor Walz as, somehow as like wanting to be a West Coast elite. They're evoking in their statement, the campaign, talk if he was trying to make Minnesota something like California, I believe. And this is somebody, again, this is a former social studies teacher. This is somebody who was a former football coach, House member from this, representing a largely rural area. I wonder how those attacks will resonate given that background, because this is not somebody who really speaks to that coastal elitism that I think the Trump campaign is trying to do. Now, it may resonate given, like I said, that while as governor of Minnesota, he did help pass some major, progressive, center-left priorities that were rejoiced by Democrats. They did not have major majorities in the Senate when they did this, in the Minnesota Senate. So they did this with, fairly, narrow support, but they were still able to get major legislative achievements true. During his first term as governor, Walz had a Republican Senate and a Democratic Minnesota House, so that same ability wasn't there. That record is likely going to be relitigated. And obviously, this is somebody who has years and years of U.S. House votes that can, will likely be gone through and dredged up by Republicans as they look to, challenge this idea. Because you have J.D. Vance, who is a Midwesterner from Ohio. So this is an interesting contrast that we'll see on the VP debate stage if that comes to pass.
It feels like ever since Biden stepped down and Harris became the top of the ticket that Trump has sort of been trying to find his stride. He's made a lot of controversial remarks and attacks against Harris. Do you feel like GOP circles right now are worried about their messaging?
That's the notable thing here, because obviously since President Joe Biden left the 2024 race, we have seen this really rather fast unification behind, rallying behind, Vice President Harris as the top of the ticket. And that's obviously, all this unity has come after, weeks and weeks of people saying, hey, Biden should drop out of the race and all that. With this VP pick, I think there was some concern of, okay, certain picks may alienate, parts of the party. If the vice president had picked Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, would that have alienated progressives? And some groups, education groups had come out against him in some circles as well. Walz seems to be that pick that I'm not sure who is going to be upset about it. Obviously, some voters, some groups could be, but this is somebody who, has sort of that high floor ability to say, hey, look, I have this record, and that's going to be a little bit tougher for the Trump campaign, to say, hey, look, Democrats are in disarray all over again like they were a month ago.
Hunter Woodall, thanks so much. Here with us now is CBS News Executive Director of Elections and Surveys, Anthony Salvanto. So, Anthony, the Battleground State Tour begins today. What kind? Obviously, you got Pennsylvania. No, you got Minnesota.
I got
pulled
Minnesota
up there. Yeah. So tell me what your graph is showing us.
Well, because, and I'm glad you say that, Lindsay, because Pennsylvania is one of the key battleground states, right? Minnesota isn't often in that conversation, and it is not a battleground state. But look, given the fact that the race nationally is even, you might have otherwise expected Minnesota to maybe at least be closer, right? And certainly the Democrats didn't want to have to defend Minnesota. I put this up because Walz ran about the same way that Joe Biden did in his race in Minnesota. So this is Walz's governor's race, and then I'll show you Joe Biden, and it's going to look very, very similar if I pull that up for a second, right? Similar margins and also similar patterns, which is to say doing pretty well, very well around Minneapolis and the suburbs, and holding his own, at least in the margins out and around the outer suburbs. The larger sense here, though, is what does this pick then do, and can it translate to the kind of demographic groups that the Democrats need to at least hold the margin on? Non-college white voters, places where the Republicans have made substantial gains over recent elections. Democrats have got to get in the mid-30s with that group. Maybe there's a part of Walz pick that helps appeal there, right? Joe Biden got 28% of non-college white men. And does Walz help bolster that, maybe bring that number up a little bit? All of that then becomes key, Lindsay, as you go through the other states of Pennsylvania, of a Michigan, of a Minnesota, where, again, getting at least enough of those kinds of groups, if this pick can help the Democrats appeal that way, are going to help with those states for the Democrats, Lindsay.
Anthony, what states did the Biden camp sort of say, okay, we're not going to put the focus there anymore because we're not sure these are winnable? And given the fact that this is such a new campaign, the Harris-Walz ticket, I mean, when he stepped down, it was, 105, 106 days until Election Day. Has that map changed at all for the new Democratic ticket?
Well, I think all the battleground states remain close. I know they do. There's another component to this, too, which is that Walz isn't a sitting member of Congress, right? And so it may put more of that focus out there on the map on those states. It's been, I'm thinking back 50 years since a Democrat has picked someone for VP or has someone for VP who isn't a sitting member of Congress, right? And the other part of that, Lindsay, is this. I'll show you this from our latest poll, which is how different do you think Harris and Biden's policies are? I've been pointing at this number a lot because it shows 2/3 of people think that Harris is mostly, but not entirely, the same as Joe Biden. And defining that difference is going to be probably the critical point for the next couple of weeks, and this pick is going to speak towards that in a lot of ways, Lindsay.
Okay, Anthony Salvanto, appreciate you. Let's go to senior White House correspondent Weijia Jiang back with us. Weijia, it is official. Kamala Harris has posted on X and Instagram.
That's right, Lindsay. She just posted on social media to sort of lay out her case for choosing Governor Tim Walz to really introduce the American public to this governor who, unlike many of the other top contenders who were vying for this spot, doesn't really have a household name. And she writes about, one of the things that stood out to her was his conviction on fighting for the middle class. You can see here, she points out that he was, is a governor, a coach, a teacher, a veteran, and he has delivered for working families before. As we've been talking about, he served Congress for 6 terms, and now he's in his second term as governor. And then if you read all the way, this is quite a lengthy statement from her. She said, "What impressed me most about Tim is his deep commitment to his family, Gwen, Gus, and Hope," referring to his children. And she said, "Doug and I look forward to working with him to build an administration that reflects our shared values." So in addition to all the experience you see on your screen right now, it really came down to who Tim Walz is as a person. And that really mattered to Vice President Harris as she made this decision that came down to the wire. In fact, she didn't make it until this morning. And I just spoke with somebody who was very familiar with the entire process, who said that on the phone call to Tim Walz, the vice president said that we are underdogs and let's get to work. So she's not, allowing all the momentum, the excitement that we have seen in recent weeks to cloud all the work that is ahead. And they really wanted to try to capitalize on this moment, get even more excitement, because the team is well aware that, that enthusiasm could dwindle. And so they want to gen up as much support, as much excitement as possible while they can, with, of course, today's big announcement. And I should point out, Lindsay, that you mentioned, but in case our viewers didn't hear this yet, what's really interesting is it was so close that her team printed out multiple versions of campaign signs for tonight's rally in Philadelphia. You can imagine that Harris Shapiro was among those, and it will be in Governor Shapiro's home state where we see now Vice President Harris and Governor Tim Walz, really make their case for the first time in public to the American people.
Yeah, let's hope they pass out the right signs, right, Ouija, at the event. I want to ask you something about something you just mentioned, the underdog framing. I mean, that in and of itself is strategy, right? Because who doesn't like rooting for an underdog?
Right, and who doesn't want to give more money to an underdog that is actually doing quite well? And in our latest CBS News poll, Harris is actually up by 1 point nationally and tied in the critical battleground states. And that 1 point is really important because Biden never enjoyed that lead. In fact, when he left the race, he was 5 points behind. But 1 point is still, not significant enough for them to lean back and say, okay, we can relax now. And that is why it's going to be a slog ahead, including this week when Walz and Harris go to several battleground states to try to maintain that kind of support, because it's not just about, getting people out in November. Between now and then, it's about making sure their operation continues and they have the infrastructure through money.
Ouija Jiang, thank you. Our domestic and global teams at CBS News continue to gather more reporting on this story. We are going to have much more ahead on Vice President Kamala Harris's running mate choice, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. The two, of course, beginning a multi-battleground state blitz in Philadelphia today. Donald Trump's running mate, J.D. Vance, will also campaign there today in a dueling rally. Stay with us. You're streaming CBS News 24/7. Vice President Kamala Harris has officially chosen Minnesota Governor Tim Walz as her running mate on the 2024 Democratic ticket. It comes after she clinched the Democratic nomination last night. Walz has been governor of Minnesota for 6 years. He is also familiar with how Congress works, serving 6 terms in the House and also sitting as a ranking member of the Veterans Affairs Committee. He has a public teaching background and is a veteran. Later today, Harris and Walz will kick off a multi-day tour of battleground states starting in Philadelphia. Let's bring in CBS News Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes, who is in Philadelphia. So, Nancy, many Americans are going to be introduced to Walz for the first time in this rally.
That's right. And what they're going to learn, and you just laid out a bit of his bio, is that he is a Midwestern governor. He has served as governor for 6 years. Before that, he served as a congressman from a large southern Minnesota district for 12 years, in which he often outperformed both the Democrats and Republicans on their presidential tickets. And that's not unusual, but he has a proven record of winning in a swing district. He is also the leader of the Democratic Governors Association. And in that capacity, he is basically in charge of coordinating with all the other Democratic governors in the country on policy, on messaging, kind of getting them all headed in the same direction. So he has deep relationships with his fellow Democratic governors that will come in handy, frankly, over the next 3 months or so as he crisscrosses the country campaigning in a variety of battleground states that are led by Democratic governors, including this one, Pennsylvania, but also Michigan and Wisconsin and Arizona, North Carolina. So those relationships are definitely going to come in handy. And then, as you mentioned, Lindsay, there's also the fact that he served in Congress for 12 years. He was on the Armed Services Committee. He was a ranking member of the Veterans Affairs Committee. He was on the Agriculture Committee. So he has experience legislating on a variety of issues, something that really comes in handy when you are vice president and you are dispatched to Capitol Hill to negotiate over the budget or any legislative priority that the White House may have.
You know, Nancy, with some of this decision, it was also a bit of political calculus and chess, right? I mean, you had Roy Cooper, who couldn't necessarily be the pick, took himself out of contention because of a Republican lieutenant governor who may interfere with, his agenda in the state. You had Mark Kelly, who Democrats could fear would vacate a Democratic Senate seat right now that could be up for grabs in a couple of years. Were there any of those concerns with Walz?
His downsides were a little less pronounced than some of the other candidates. And at the end of the day, that may be why he got the nod. When you look at potential opposition research on him by Republicans, what they're going to hit him with, there's the fact that he waited a couple of days too long, many of his critics say, before calling in the National Guard during riots over the murder of George Floyd. But then he moved fairly quickly to push through criminal justice reform in his state. So he kind of mitigated that weakness. Beyond that, Democrats feel that it's going to be pretty difficult to attack him. Just last week, J.D. Vance was on a podcast, and when he was asked about the various Democrats being considered for VP, he mentioned Walz first. He said, I'm hearing a lot about this Walz guy, but he seems really angry to me. Not sure that really fits Walz's persona. He's kind of a happy warrior. There's a reason that the term Minnesota nice is so well known. Politicians there are legendary for being able to go on the attack with a smile on their face. But again, it sort of shows that it is going to be somewhat difficult for Republicans to go after him because, as far as we know right now, there aren't a whole lot of skeletons in his closet.
And let's talk about what we might expect to hear from Vance this afternoon, Nancy. He's made some questionable comments about whether, if Democrats didn't pick Governor Shapiro, do you expect that he'll repeat those today?
Yeah, and I expect that he's going to argue that with Walz, the Harris-Walz ticket is the most liberal presidential ticket in a generation. He's going to argue that Walz is more of the same when it comes to politics. But the argument that the Harris campaign is making is that a lot of the so-called liberal policies that he has managed to lead on in Minnesota, things like paid leave, things like free school breakfast and lunch, things like codifying Roe v. Wade, they argue that those are things that are quite popular with the populace writ large, people from the left and certainly from the middle as well.
Nancy Cordes, thank you. Let's go to CBS News reporter Pauline Lee joining us now from Minnesota outside Walz's home where there is a healthy media presence. Pauline, thank you for being with us. I want to talk to you before we talk about the reaction and what you're hearing from people. I want to talk about the governor's reputation, what he's known for in your state.
He's known for being very straightforward. Obviously, we now know that he coined the word weird to describe the Trump-Vance ticket, and that's very much him. He's very much straightforward, and he calls it how he sees it. I think that's what, for his supporters, what resonates to him the most, or what resonates to them the most. But it's interesting, too, because obviously you see kind of like the crowd that's growing behind me that's actually spilling into the streets. If I step out of the way here, his crowd has grown significantly. You even see a couple in front of me taking a selfie in front of the home here, just waiting to see if Governor Walz will step out of his residence. But it's not just media outlets out here, it's also supporters out here. Obviously, a huge announcement this morning. I even ran into a gentleman who lives right around the corner here, and I asked him this morning, what do you think? And he said, I thought he had a long shot, but he didn't say that necessarily as a knock to him or necessarily as a supportive to him, but more so as almost kind of Minnesota is just a very quiet Midwestern state. I mean, up until 4 years ago, the murder of George Floyd, Minnesota doesn't necessarily make national headlines, now making probably the biggest national headline to date, especially with this campaign. So it's interesting to see how people are reacting to the news this morning. In fact, Governor Tim Walz actually writing his first tweet since this morning's announcement about 11 minutes ago, him saying it's an honor of a lifetime to join Kamala Harris in this campaign. I am all in. Vice President Harris is showing us the politics of what is possible. It reminds me a bit of my first day of school, which is a nod to his time as an educator. So let's get this done, folks. Join us. So it'll be interesting to see how he reacts now with his first interviews. Still yet to come, guys.
Okay, Pauline Lee, thank you so much for joining us. I want to bring in now former Minnesota Governor Tim Pawlenty for more on this announcement. Thank you for being with us, sir. I want to get your reaction to Walz now being Vice President Harris's running mate.
Well, good morning to you and to your viewers. First of all, congratulations to Governor Walz. This is a big honor and an accomplishment by him. And while I don't agree with him politically and on his views and his worldview, I certainly congratulate him. Beyond that, I think it represents a number of things. One is a doubling down of the progressive agenda. Vice President Harris and Governor Walz both present as people who are extremely progressive. I don't know if the country will go for that. We'll see soon enough, but it's clearly by way of resume and style and geography, it's a ticket balancing move, but in terms of philosophy and policy, it's doubling down on a pretty far left agenda.
Governor, I don't know how much time you spent working, if at all, with Walz, but what is your read on him as a leader? We just heard Pauline Lee say he's sort of known as a guy who just says it like it is. Is that also your read?
Yeah, I know him. I've done a bunch of stuff with him over the years. I like him, and he's capable. He's going to be a good campaigner. My only problem with him is policy views. And I think in terms of what people will learn about him, he is pretty straightforward. He's pretty folksy. He's friendly, but he has more than one gear. He can be that Minnesota nice or friendly, folksy person, and he can also be the attack dog when need be. And I think that's one of the reasons Vice President Harris selected him, is because she's going to need somebody to help fight this fight from their perspective against the Republican ticket.
We can discuss a little bit more about your ideological differences, but Governor, I also want to ask you, one thing our CBS News teams have been reporting is that Harris wanted somebody who could lead on day one and step into the presidency if need be. Do you think that Walz fits that bill?
Well, nobody's probably ultimately prepared for that unless they've done it before. So relative to the other competitors and people who would normally fill these roles, yes, I think that part of it. So it's that, plus do they have good chemistry together? It seems they do. We've talked about this being an amplification pick, not a balancing pick in terms of philosophy. And then lastly, I think the question is, what does he bring politically to the table? And Minnesota was probably going to go for Harris anyhow, so he doesn't bring a state. But I think he's at least going to bring the appearance of somebody who's unlike the California, San Francisco vibe. It's somebody from the Midwest with a different vibe. And I think that's partly what they were looking for.
Governor, you have outlined some demographic differences between the two on the ticket, but you say that they are both progressive leaning. They have the same ideologies. Are you comfortable right now with the line of attacks that you have been hearing from the GOP and specifically the Trump-Vance ticket against their now rivals?
Well, those attacks will now spool up and we'll get to see them in full force. But I think what the Trump campaign will focus on will include the following. One, the failure to timely call out the National Guard after the riots. And Trump loves to talk about that. Two, Governor Walz presided over and proposed the largest spending increase in Minnesota history, nearly 40% in one budget cycle, which is jaw-dropping. There was very high-profile fraud cases under his watch and during his administration that the legislative auditor, nonpartisan, said don't appear to be taken very seriously in terms of fixing the problem or addressing the problem the way the auditor thought. Crime is going to be an issue, and the list goes on. But obviously, President Trump is going to focus on things that are going to try to get voters to change and persuadable voters in swing states. And I think of that list that I just gave you, that's going to be of interest to a lot of those voters.
I mean, you mentioned, the state budget under Trump, the national deficit did grow. You mentioned law and order. We know that Trump has railed against the FBI, the DOJ, many of the law enforcement officers who were defending the Capitol on January 6th. I'll let you respond to that. But also, Governor, are you comfortable with some of the attacks that we're hearing from Trump against Harris, questioning her identity, saying she just turned black?
No, I'm totally uncomfortable with that. Vice President Harris has said she is of mixed race. And Trump's comments in that regard were bizarre. I don't know why he said that. It's just strange and unfortunate and unfair, and he should have never said it.
Former Minnesota Governor Tim Pawlenty, we really appreciate you joining us on a busy news day. Thank you, sir. Let's go to CBS News congressional correspondent Nicole Killian for more on the announcement. So, Nicole, what are we hearing so far from lawmakers?
Well, we are hearing a mixed reaction, certainly from some Republicans like Tom Emmer, who is a Republican from Minnesota. He is criticizing this pick, saying that it's kind of more of the same with respect to Democratic policies in terms of continuing open borders and the like. But then you also have many Democrats who really seem energized and excited by this pick, particularly fellow Minnesotans like Ilhan Omar, who calls the governor the North Star governor. You have other members, Amy Klobuchar, praising this pick, of course, who was just with the governor last night at a fundraiser for the vice president. Senator LaFonza Butler, you see there, who was presiding at the Capitol during a pro forma session, saying that, you know, if this is the pick that the vice president wants to go with, that she is ecstatic about it. Look, I think, you know, there are certainly general affinity for Governor Walz among many House Democrats in particular, since he served a number of years in the House, so much so that many were advocating for him to be the pick. And so now that he is, certainly some gratification and elation on the part of many Democrats who feel that this not only aligns with the ticket, but could potentially align with their agenda on Capitol Hill as well.
We heard Nancy Cordes say, you know, he's seasoned in Congress. He knows how it works. He could be crucial when it comes to negotiating if he needs to make that trip and try and get legislation pushed through as part of the ticket if they were to win. What do we know about his record and reputation from his time as a representative?
Well, one thing that's interesting about Governor Walz, you know, when he was a member of Congress, well, certainly he voted with the party some 90% of the time. He didn't always go along to get along. So there were times that he broke party ranks. For instance, you know, there was controversial Keystone Pipeline back in 2014, 2015. He was just one of about 24 or so Democrats who supported a legislation to advance that project, much to the dissatisfaction of many environmentalists. And then also, most notably, you know, he was one of few Democrats who actually voted to hold Eric Holder in contempt of Congress for the whole Fast and Furious gun trafficking investigation, which is notable because we know Eric Holder was involved in this vetting process. So clearly that didn't seem to be a sticking point as far as his vetting might have been concerned or as far as the vice president's ultimate decision. But, you know, he certainly is someone who could work across the aisle, but also knows how to toe the party line as well.
Nicole Killian, thank you so much. Let's bring in CBS News political contributor Ashley Etienne. Ashley served as communications director for Vice President Harris. Ashley, I'm not sure if you heard my interview with former Governor Tim Pawlenty.
I did, yes.
Do you have any response to what he said in terms of ideologically them being the same on the ticket and painting them far left of center?
Well, I mean, you know, the one unique thing about Walz compared to some of the others that were being talked about, and then really compared to a lot of members in the Democratic Party, is he's got the support of Democrats across the political spectrum within the party. So not just those that are much more conservative right of center, but also the progressive caucus rallied around him. So, I mean, it suggests that Tim Walz is a very practical, pragmatic type of a legislator. And I think that's what they're going to lean on in terms of the campaign, what they're going to elevate to push back on this liberal left narrative that the Republicans are going to try to push. But here's the thing, as I was saying earlier, you know, the ticket is going to have to run its own race and understand who they're appealing to. The concerns about them being left-leaning liberals is likely not going to be as persuasive when they're up against the threat that Donald Trump presents, and especially when it comes to the 1% to 2%. That'll make the difference in these battleground states. So I can see a situation where Tim Walz is in those states, those battleground states, from the suburban areas to the rural areas, again, speaking these people, you know, those people's language, identifying with them, and creating this permission structure for them to come on board and support the ticket and Kamala Harris. And so I think, you know, these attacks aren't going to land very well. And I think he can easily position himself as pragmatic versus being left or right, because that's actually who he is.
So, Ashley, as part of that permission structure that you just outlined, do you see this new ticket trying to tie themselves closely to Joe Biden and what they consider his legislative priorities in office? Or do you see them trying to outline some of the differences when we take a look at how Biden was polling prior to him dropping out?
Well, Kamala Harris is in this very unique, unprecedented position where she's an incumbent, yet she's a challenger. And what I mean by that is she can take areas and aspects of their record that they achieved together and dump a lot of Joe Biden's baggage, some of that around the economy, even some of that around the war in Gaza. So she's got that advantage where she can claim the aspects of the record that work for her, but she's going to also lay out a vision for the country going forward. She's already starting to talk about the promise of America, the past versus the future. I think she's going to continue to hone that message, refine that message, and it'll include some of the aspects of the record, but she'll have space to create her own vision, which she's, you know, going down the path and doing as we speak.
Ashley, I have less than a minute with you, but we heard former Governor Pawlenty say that he thinks the Trump-Vance campaign should and will focus on budget concerns with Walz at the state level as governor, and also law and order with what we saw in the post-George Floyd murder protests. How do you see this new ticket countering those attacks?
Well, I mean, I think they got to counter with Trump's record. I mean, Trump added $8 trillion to the deficit. We had record unemployment under Trump. Racial violence was at an all-time high in our nation's history. So they need to be aggressive in pushing back on the Republican rhetoric and highlighting those days and reminding people, as the vice president says, we don't want to go back to those days. And I think Tim Walz is going to be essential in that. You know, one thing I know about Vice President Harris is she suffers no fools. And Tim Walz is equally as aggressive in terms of messaging and pushing back on Republican narrative. So I think this is going to be a great head-to-head, and I'm looking forward to seeing them on the trail.
We already see one tweet from RNC Research on our screen right now with Tim Walz. He said, fled as rioters burned Minnesota to the ground like a coward. This, of course, coming from the RNC. Ashley Etienne, thank you for joining us. We appreciate it. We're going to have continuing coverage throughout the day on this major announcement. Vice President Kamala Harris picking Minnesota Governor Tim Walz as her running mate. We'll see the two in Philadelphia today. We'll also see J.D. Vance there. We're going to bring you all of the latest. But right now, an encore of CBS Mornings is next.